The form had 17 pages. Dr. Vivian Ashford was on page 9 when the Vaoth ambassador began his 40th minute of speech about humanity's potential. She did not look up. She had things to file. The hall of the Galactic Council was built by beings with strong opinions about ceilings. The ceiling above her stretched 40 meters high, curving inward at the edges in a way that pulled the eye upward, whether it wanted to go there or not. The walls were pale mineral composite lit from inside. Every surface reflected light back into the room at a slightly different angle, so the whole space glowed with a vague and sourceless significance. Vivian had been here 11 times in 3 years. The room tried to make her feel small every single time she let it try. She had things to file. Page 11 asked for fleet composition by class. She picked up her stylus and worked through it carefully. She was the kind of person who filled in every field, including the optional ones, because the forms were designed by someone who thought every field mattered, and she was inclined to give that person the benefit of the doubt. The chamber held 42 delegations. Most of them were watching Ambassador Vaith, the Vaoth representative, whose full name required specific equipment to pronounce. He had been speaking for 40 minutes about the noble promise of humanity's observer status and the great honor of their inclusion and the profound hope the Council held for their continued participation in the project of galactic peace. He had not mentioned the Neroth once. That told Vivian everything she needed to know about the first 40 minutes of the speech. Garrett Holloway leaned in from the chair to her right. "Should we be listening to this?" "I am listening," Vivian said. "You're on page 11. "I can do 2 things." Garrett sat back. He had been her aide for just over 2 years. In that time, he had learned several things about Dr. Vivian Ashford. That she finished everything she started, that she was never late, that she was always right, and that arguing with her while she was doing paperwork was an activity with no return on investment. He folded his hands and watched the ambassador speak. The Nareth situation had been building for 3 months. It started with a border monitoring station going offline. Not destroyed, not attacked, simply offline. Reporting nothing, responding to no contact. That happens sometimes in deep space for reasons having nothing to do with aggression. The Council logged it and waited. Then a cargo corridor used by 4 species was quietly redirected. No announcement, no explanation, no authority cited. 340 ships using it simply found new coordinates in their updated navigation data one morning. Then a colony world in the outer Polari territories received a message from the Neroth government. It was framed as a formal greeting. It included within its greeting structure a very detailed assessment of the colony's population resources and distance from Polari defense installations. 2.3 million people, 17 agricultural zones, 8 light hours from the nearest patrol group. The Council convened emergency sessions twice. Both times the sessions produced resolutions urging continued dialogue and expressing collective concern. The resolutions were drafted, voted on, transmitted, and ignored. This time they wanted contributions. Every species with military capacity was asked to complete a contribution assessment form. Ship classes, armament categories, deployment timelines, strategic reserve configurations. The assembled totals would form a unified response force. The theory was that the Neroth would see the combined number, calculate the cost of their current trajectory, and choose a different one. Vivian had received the form 4 days ago. She filled it out with the same care she brought to every official document. She checked the figures 3 times, one more than she usually checked anything, because she had a reasonable suspicion about what the form's intake system was built to handle. The system rejected her first submission of Section 7C with an automated response. Value exceeds input parameters. Please verify entry. She verified the entry. It was correct. She resubmitted with a short note attached. This is not a typo. The system accepted the second submission and issued a confirmation receipt with 1 flag marked beside her entry. Value pending verification. She had turned back to page 12 and kept going. Now she was on page 15, and the ambassador was wrapping toward his conclusion. She could tell because he had reached the part that used the word together in every other sentence, which was his rhetorical signal for a closing argument. Garrett was watching the contribution display board at the front of the chamber, where submission totals appeared in real time as delegations filed their forms. "The Dainaki are in," he said quietly. 8 dreadnoughts, 1,200 support vessels. "Good. The Vaoth submitted 12 dreadnoughts, 340 capital ships. Vivian turned a page. I saw our submission just posted. Good. A pause. Vivian, she was on page 16. The board stopped. She looked up. The display had frozen mid-update. A technician near the side of the chamber was at it, the control panel moving quickly with the focused expression of someone troubleshooting something they had not expected to troubleshoot. The board flickered, resumed, froze again, then it loaded. Next to the human delegation's entry on the contribution board, a number appeared. The Dranaki representative across the aisle turned his head. He read the number. He read it again. He did not look away from the board. Vivian looked at it, checked it against her own tablet, found it accurate, returned to page 16. Is that right? Garrett said. His voice had gone quiet in the way of someone who was not sure what volume was appropriate for the situation. Yes. That's yes. Page 17 covered resolution protocols for ambiguous engagement scenarios. Vivian found it the most interesting section of the whole document. By the time she signed the final page and set her stylus down, 4 delegations had stopped what they were doing and were looking at the board. The Vaoth ambassador had abandoned his conclusion entirely and was standing motionless near the Chalari section, staring at the number with the expression of a person who has measured a room 3 times and gotten 3 different answers and is beginning to suspect the room is the problem. Vivian closed her tablet. She finished the last of her coffee. Cold. It tasted like the idea of coffee rather than the actual thing. She drank it anyway. She stood, straightened her jacket, nodded to Garrett, and walked out of the hall of the Galactic Council with 17 completed pages and the clean, unremarkable calm of a person who had done exactly what was asked of them. Nothing extra, nothing missing. In the corridor outside, she sent one message to Earth Fleet Command. Form submitted, expect contact within 48 hours. She was off by 45. The contact came in 3 hours. Administrator Vale Toth called at 600 station time, which was either very early by council standards or exactly on time by Vaoth standards, and Vivian had long suspected the Vaoth did not recognize the distinction. She was eating eggs at the small table in the human delegation's quarters. Garrett was across from her with his morning briefing tablet. The comm chimed, and his eyebrows went up slightly when the caller identification came through. Vale Toth was 312 years old. He had been administrating council processes since before humanity had figured out orbital mechanics. His carapace had gone translucent near the joints, and his eyes held the quality of very old, very precise instruments. Slow to focus and impossible to fool. Vivian had met him once at a formal reception. He had asked her 2 questions about Earth's southern hemisphere agricultural systems and remembered both her answers 6 months later. He was not a person who asked questions he did not intend to use. He had never called her directly before. Ambassador Ashford, he said. His voice had the quality of a person choosing each word like stepping stones across a narrow stream. Administrator. The Council's Administrative Office has completed a preliminary review of your delegation's contribution submission. Good, she said. There appears to be a discrepancy. She took a sip of coffee. What kind of a numerical one? A pause long enough to be significant. The figure you entered in Section 7C appears to have exceeded the processing parameters of our intake system. Garrett had put his tablet down. He was watching her face. What parameters are those? The field was designed to accept values between 1 and 9,999 units. Your entry. He stopped, started again. The system was unable to render it. The output field displayed a series of query symbols. I included a note with the resubmission, Vivian said. It said the entry was not a typo. A silence. The kind that is wait. Yes, he said. We saw the note, which is why I am calling rather than issuing a correction request through standard channels. Could you provide the intended value verbally for the record, she told him, the same way she would tell someone a flight number or a street address, plainly, without preamble. The silence that followed was different from the previous one. The previous one had been a person choosing words. This one was a person doing something else entirely, recalibrating something they had held as stable, adjusting an assumption that had been so long established they had stopped noticing it was an assumption. Then Vale Toth said carefully, I want to confirm I understand your classification system correctly. By Dreadnought, you mean? She walked him through it. She used the definitions from the form itself because those were the agreed terms. Class 4 or above, minimum 4 kilometers in length, armament sufficient for sustained planetary siege operations, independent logistics and resupply capacity, full operational autonomy for a minimum of 18 months. Yes, those ships, exactly those. And the figure you provided represents current active inventory. As of last quarter's count, she said, updated monthly. There is some variance depending on maintenance rotations and construction schedules, but the figure is accurate to within approximately 300 units. Silence. 300 units of variance, he said slowly, like someone repeating the dimensions of a room they had just learned was much larger than the building containing it. Give or take, she said. The construction rings operate on independent scheduling. He asked after a moment how many construction rings there were. She told him that too. The call went quiet long enough that she finished 2 more bites of eggs and drank half her coffee before he spoke again. Ambassador Ashford, he said at last, I will be routing your submission to the Security Committee for manual review. This is standard procedure for any entry that requires a system override. I want to assure you this is not a reflection of any concern regarding your delegation's conduct. I understand, Vivian said. I would also note informally that the other contributing delegations have submitted without incident and that your submission represents a, he paused, significant point of discussion among my colleagues. I imagine it does, Vivian said. She thanked him for calling. She set the comm down. Garrett was looking at her with the expression he used when he had been presented with information that required several minutes of quiet processing before any response was possible. The Security Committee, he said. Yes. That's the full panel, 14 species. Admiral Shorvac chairs the Donaki seat. I know. He is not historically a being who responds to unexpected information with warmth and open arms. He does not need to respond with warmth, Vivian said. He needs to understand what he is looking at. Once he understands his response, will adjust accordingly. She pushed back from the table. That is the point. What followed in the next 24 hours, Vivian learned mostly from Garrett, who had cultivated a source in the Vayoth Administrative Office over the previous year on the sensible grounds that bureaucrats who like you will always share things that bureaucrats who do not like you will not. Vale Toth routed the submission up to the Vayoth High Administrator with a note flagging it for priority review. The High Administrator read it. He looked at the figure. He forwarded it to the Donaki military liaison attached to Council Security Operations, framing the forward as a courtesy cross-check, standard practice when submissions deviated significantly from projected norms. The Donaki liaison read the number. He placed the document on his desk. He picked it up again. He read it again. He placed it down again. In the Donaki language, there is a word Velcroath, which translates roughly as the feeling of reaching for something you believe was a wall and finding it was not. It implies a reorganization of understood space, a reclassification of the solid and permanent. The liaison used the word 4 times in the response message he sent back to the Vayoth High Administrator. The High Administrator forwarded the entire chain to Veltoth with a single added line, so schedule the full committee. The formal request arrived in Vivian's office in person. Clarification before the Security Committee at the human delegation's earliest convenience. She checked her schedule. Thursday was open. Veltoth's response came back in 11 minutes. Thursday was available for all committee members. The Grand Hall of Security Review, which had last been convened in full session 11 years ago for a territorial dispute between 2 established member species, was available Thursday. Everyone, it appeared, had cleared their Thursdays. Bring documentation, Veltoth added at the end of his message. Vivian replied that she would bring the first 40 pages of the primary asset index. A pause before his response came back. The first 40 pages, the full index runs somewhat long, she said. We can discuss how the committee would like to handle the remainder once we are in session. She did not specify the full index's length. She sent Garrett to the print office. He came back 30 minutes later looking like a man who had carried something heavier than expected, which was accurate because the 40-page preliminary brief and the separately bound index summary together came to just under 2 kilograms. Admiral Thaddeus Crane came by that afternoon. Crane was the head of the full human diplomatic corps, a position he had held for 4 years, and he had the sustained, forward-leaning energy of a person who had spent 4 years staying ahead of fast-moving situations. He had heard about the security committee summons. He had also heard about the display board incident in the main council chamber, because he arrived with the expression of a man who had been receiving briefings since early morning and was trying to determine how concerned to be. He stood in the doorway and said, "How concerned should I be?" "Not very," Vivian said. "That is a different answer from not at all." "Yes," she agreed. He waited. "Thursday will be clarifying," she said, "for everyone." Crane looked at the documentation stack Garrett had placed on the side table. He looked at the bound index. He looked back at Vivian with the expression of a man who had asked a reasonable question and received a reasonable answer that somehow left him more unsettled than before. "Bring your own coffee," she said. "The council's synthesized drinks are a form of punishment." He stared at her. "Right," he said finally. "Thursday." "Thursday," she agreed. He left. Garrett straightened the documentation stack. Vivian reviewed her notes for the committee session, made 3 small additions, and decided the rest could wait for the morning. Outside the window of the delegation quarters, the council station turned in its slow and orderly rotation. Somewhere 2 light towers distant, the Narath were calculating their next move. Nothing had happened yet. Thursday would be different. The Grand Hall of Security Review was smaller than the main council chamber. The ceiling was lower, the walls tighter. Every dimension calibrated to communicate that whatever was discussed here was too serious to require a grand setting. Long tables arranged in a horseshoe shape. The human delegations seated at the open end facing 14 delegations arranged in a curved row. 14 species, 23 officials. The Chalari representatives in environment suits. The regulators making a faint sound that never quite became background noise. Admiral Shorovak standing at the far right of the arc. Danaki did not sit during sessions where their assessment of the situation was not yet settled. It was a cultural practice Vivian's briefing files described as readiness signaling. She noted it without comment. She placed the documentation package on the table in front of her. It made a solid, dense sound on the surface. Vale Toth, chairing from the center of the arc, looked at the documentation package with the careful attention of a being cataloging potential complications. He opened the session formally. Standard language about the purpose of clarification proceedings, the Council's commitment to treating all delegations with equal respect, the procedural basis for the committee's authority. 3 delegations requested the floor before he finished the opening statement. Vivian let them go first. The Polari representative spoke first. Their species communicated in a blend of speech and visible color shifts along the neck tissue, and the neck was currently in a range Vivian associated with controlled concern. Perhaps the representative suggested carefully humanity use the term Dreadnought to describe vessels that other species would classify differently. Cross-species military taxonomy presented genuine translation challenges. It was possible there had been a classification inconsistency. Vivian said the definitions she used were the form's own definitions. She had applied no broader interpretation. The Polari neck shifted further into a yellow-orange range. A mid-tier counselor named Revis, representing the Sarandai, asked about the construction ring figure. 6 active rings. Were all 6 currently operational, or did that figure include rings under development or awaiting resource allocation? Vivian said 6 active rings, all producing at current capacity. Revith exchanged a short word with the delegate beside Hero, then looking back at Vivian. "And these rings are operating because we needed more ships," Vivian said. The Chalari delegation suits registered a temperature drop of approximately 6 degrees over the next 30 seconds. Vivian had been in enough meetings with Chalari to know this was not a mechanical issue. Their internal temperature responses to information were involuntary and precise, which made them the most honest communicators in the room. Even when they said nothing aloud, Shorovak had not spoken. He was still standing. The quality of his stillness was not patience. It was the specific, focused stillness of a military mind running calculations. When the other delegations finished their questions, he spoke. "Ambassador Ashford," his voice was low and flat, built for large rooms. "My delegation requests a live verification under Protocol 7. Physical confirmation is required when any single submission exceeds standard projection thresholds by 20% or more. Your submission exceeds that threshold considerably. We invoke the protocol. Vivian said, of course. A sample deployment representative of the submitted figure. Neutral coordinates confirmed by the chair. Agreed. His pale eyes held hers. A minimum of 10% of the submitted figure. Agreed, Vivian said. She picked up her comm. Vale Toth's office and Shorvax's liaison confirmed coordinates in 4 minutes. A neutral deep space location. 2 light towers from the council station. On the primary long-range observation array. Clean, measurable. Vivian made the call. Begin sample deployment. Coordinates as transmitted. 10% of Class 4 assets and above. Standard formation. The observation feed came up on the wall display behind Vale Toth's position. The first FTOL emergent signatures appeared on the feed like lights being switched on in a dark building. Precise and organized. Each one resolving from the brief blue-white flash of transition into the solid, enormous shape of a human dreadnought holding position. The scale indicator in the feed's lower corner adjusted once, then again, recalibrating for the actual dimensions of what it was now being asked to represent. The room watched. Vivian watched the room. The Polari representative leaned forward. Not a deliberate movement, but the body responding to something the mind was still catching up to. The Serendai counselor beside them pressed both hands flat on the table surface, fingers spread, as if verifying the table was still there. The second wave arrived, more ships, holding formation. The first wave adjusted slightly to accommodate them. The whole arrangement perfectly ordered. The kind of order that comes from either extraordinary training or extraordinary numbers. And in this case, it was both. The third wave. Shorvac took one step toward the display screen and stopped himself. One step. His instincts had moved him before his discipline caught up. He stood very still after that, but the step had happened and Vivian had seen it, and she suspected he knew she had seen it. The Veoth High Administrator was counting under his breath. She could not hear him, but she could see his lips moving. He counted for a while. He stopped at a number she could not identify, but the point at which he stopped counting suggested he had reached the boundary of what counting felt like an appropriate response to. The ships kept coming. The display system began to struggle. It had been built for fleet reviews of the kind the galaxy had previously produced, designed for numbers that resolved into individual hull shapes at reasonable viewing distance. The more distant vessels began rendering as compressed light clusters, bright masses at the edge of the frame where the resolution of individual shapes was no longer possible. The system was doing everything it had been designed to do. It was not enough for what it was being asked to show. The count in the corner of the feed climbed. At 15,000, the UVOS delegate who had been taking notes set his stylus down. At 28,000, one of Shorvac's aides seated in the row behind him made a sound that was not a word in any language Vivian had been briefed on. It was the sound of a mind making a very rapid adjustment to a very large assumption. At 38,000, the Polari neck tissue went a color Vivian had no reference for in her briefing materials. She filed the observation for later. At 44,000, Revist leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a person doing mathematics they had not planned to do today. The count continued. At 51,000, the deployment completed. Vivian's comm confirmed full arrival and stable formation. She checked the figure against her briefing sheet, looked up at the committee. 51,412 vessels, she said. That represents 10% of Class 4 assets and above as requested under Protocol 7. The room absorbed this in the kind of silence that has actual physical weight. Shorvac turned from the display slowly. He turned like a person making sure their expression is fully under control before it becomes visible. He looked at Vivian. 10%, he said. Yes, this is 10%. Of Class 4 and above, she said. It does not include Classes 1 through 30. It does not include the Home System Reserve Fleet, which operates under a separate command structure and was not part of the contribution assessment calculation. She paused. I also want to be transparent. 6 deep space construction rings are currently in active operation, and their quarterly output will be reflected in the next assessment update. If the committee would like those production projection figures, I can have them to you by end of week. Nobody responded to the offer about projection figures. Vivian picked up her coffee cup. She had brought it from the delegation quarters. She had not touched it since sitting down because she had been counting ships on the feed and had lost track somewhere above 30,000. She drank it cold. It tasted like the memory of what she had been thinking about when she made it. She drank it anyway. Veiltoth said, "The committee thanks the human delegation for cooperating with Protocol 7 verification. We will recess for 1 hour." A pause. "There will be a full council inquiry session. Not the security committee alone. The full 42 delegation council. The High Arbiter has confirmed availability. Thursday of next week." "I will be there," Vivian said. Nathaniel Voss collected the documentation. Vivian stood, nodded to the committee, nodded specifically to Shorvac, and walked out. The corridor was long and quiet. Garrett fell in beside her, and they walked in silence for a while. 44,000, he said eventually. "That was when the Polari neck went that color I have never seen." I noticed. "Do you know what that color means?" "I have a guess," she said. "What is your guess?" She thought about it. Something along the lines of the wall we thought was behind us was not a wall. Garrett was quiet for a moment. "That seems accurate." They walked the rest of the way without speaking. Through the tall windows at the end of the corridor, 2 light towers away, the feed was still running. 50,000 ships holding their positions in the dark, waiting for further instructions. They had been built to wait. They were good at it. The full council inquiry opened on a Tuesday morning, which Vivian had always thought was an honest day of the week. Not the optimism of Monday, not the accelerating certainty of Wednesday. Tuesday was a day that knew it was in the middle of something and was not pretending otherwise. She arrived 7 minutes early. Garrett was beside her. Nathaniel Voss, the delegation's legal documentation specialist, was on her left with a folder containing the 4 pages of notes she had prepared and nothing else. 42 delegations were seated. Seats that had been empty during the security committee demonstration were now all filled. Every delegation with access to the long-range observation feeds had seen the deployment record. Every delegation had been briefed. The room was as fully prepared as a room can be to ask a question whose answer it has already partially seen and still cannot fully process. Vivian placed her folder on the table. She did not open it. She waited. The High Arbiter opened the session with standard inquiry. Language. The gathering of information, not the assignment of fault. The equal treatment of all delegations. The Council's commitment to transparent process. Delivered neutrally. Professional. Vivian had heard this language before in other sessions. Today it landed differently. The floor opened. The Vaoth ambassador went first. He was a different one from the ambassador who had given the 40-minute speech about humanity's potential 2 weeks earlier. This one was younger, sharper delivery. He had clearly spent time with his prepared remarks. He spoke for 22 minutes. His central argument was about the Council's collective security framework and something he called the principle of proportional contribution, which he framed as a foundational shared understanding between all member and observer species. No species, he argued, should unilaterally accumulate assets beyond what was necessary for their own defense without Council awareness and agreement. The phrase reasonable defensive necessity appeared 4 times in his statement. Vivian had written it down the first time she heard it 2 weeks ago. She wrote it down again each time he used it. When the ambassador finished, Shorvac rose. He used no notes. He never used notes for formal proceedings. He delivered 11 minutes of precise, structured argument. No species builds significantly beyond sufficiency without a purpose. This was not an accusation. This was a statement of strategic logic that applied to every civilization capable of building anything at all. A house is built to a size. A wall is built to a height. Both reflect an intention. The question was not an attack on humanity's character. The question was simply, what is the purpose? The Chalari delegation submitted a written statement, read aloud by the session recorder, because the Chalari's natural communication mode was incompatible with council floor proceedings. The statement was 4 sentences. The Chalari found the situation deeply concerning. They were reviewing their understanding of the galaxy's actual distribution of military capacity. They would be reassessing their own defense posture in light of new information. They expected this reassessment would take some time. 4 sentences, each doing the work of a much longer document. The Polari spoke. The Uvos spoke. The Serendai spoke. The combined picture from their statements was this: humanity had spent 11 years in observer status, quiet and participatory, filing forms, attending sessions, building consensus carefully the way you build something you intend to keep. And the entire time it had been operating a military infrastructure that no one in the council had known to account for, at a scale that the council's own administrative systems were not designed to hold, growing at a rate that had been invisible because no one had thought to ask. 3 delegations did not request speaking time, but submitted written notes requesting further bilateral engagement with the human delegation. The formal language meant, "We want to speak to you privately without the whole room watching about what this means for our arrangements." When the last delegation finished, the High Arbiter gave Vivian the floor. She stood. She did not open her folder. "I appreciate the time and the seriousness with which these concerns have been raised," she said. "I'm going to address the points that matter most and trust the committee to ask follow-up questions if anything requires clarification." She looked at the Vayoth ambassador. The phrase reasonable defensive necessity was used several times this morning. I wrote it down each time. It is a phrase that makes complete logical sense if your species has never reached the point where reasonable preparation was not enough. She paused for 2 seconds. "We have reached that point more than once." The room held the silence. 11 years ago, before we joined this council, we lost a deep space logistics ship, the USS Perseverance, 3,000 personnel. The ship was given wrong coordinates, a clerical error. Someone at a desk on Earth typed the wrong number. By the time the discrepancy was identified, the rescue timeline had closed. She let that sit. 3,000 people died because one person made one mistake with one number. Their names are on a memorial database. Most people access it once, if at all. She looked at Shorovak. Admiral Shorovak's argument is correct. No species builds past sufficiency without a purpose. Our purpose was this: we decided as a species that we would never again be caught without enough. Her voice did not rise, did not fall. Enough to defend every world we had settled. Enough to hold every line we had drawn. Enough that no one calculating a risk would ever look at us and decide we were an acceptable cost. She looked at the High Arbiter. "We submitted the form you asked us to submit. We answered every question asked of us. We attended every session, filed every document, cooperated with every procedural request that came to us." She picked up her folder, did not open it, simply held it. "We were never asked about the fleet." She sat down. The room held the particular silence that follows something received but not yet fully sorted. Then Elder Mothvo raised one hand from the far left of the council arc. He was the oldest Vayoth in the chamber, possibly the oldest currently serving council member of any species. His carapace had gone fully translucent near the joints, and the color of his eyes was a deep and settled amber, the kind you see in instruments that have been working correctly for a very long time. He had been alive when the vote to grant humanity observer status was taken. He had, according to historical records, proposed the original resolution language himself. The High Arbiter granted him the floor. Mothvo looked at Vivian with the patient, unhurried attention of a being who had spent 3 centuries listening and had learned precisely when words were worth the effort. He said, "Were you planning to tell us?" The question was not accusatory. It held no performance of outrage. It was the question of a very old and very careful mind that had heard everything the session had produced and had decided that this was the one thing it actually needed to know. Vivian held the question for a moment. She thought about the form, about page 17, about the note she had attached to the resubmission that said simply, "This is not a typo." "We submitted the form," she said. "We answered accurately. We never provided false information and never withheld information that was formally requested." She held his gaze. "We were simply never asked." Mothvo held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he nodded, small, slow, the nod of a person who has received an answer that is both complete and insufficient and who understands exactly why it is both. "No," he said quietly. "I suppose you were not." The High Arbiter called a 2-hour recess. Yes. In the corridor outside, Admiral Crane came alongside Vivian and walked without speaking for almost a full minute. She let him find his own pace. 4 delegations sent formal treaty requests during the session, he said finally. While the inquiry was still open, I have them queued. Add them to Nathaniel's schedule, Vivian said. Vivian, he stopped walking. She stopped with him. The Danaki liaison contacted our office 30 minutes ago. A private meeting, not the committee, not a formal proceeding, specifically with you. Schedule it, she said. They also specified it should be off the record. That's fine. Crane looked at her for a long moment. You expected this? I thought it was likely, she said. You thought they would respond to finding out about the fleet by wanting to make arrangements. I thought the ones who were afraid would be less afraid once they understood the situation clearly, and the ones who saw opportunity would move toward it. She started walking again. Neither of those is a bad outcome. Crane kept pace. And the Narath, she glanced at him. The deployment record has been in the Council's public files for 6 days. Every member with long-range observation access has the data. The Narath have long-range observation access. She paused. They are recalculating. Crane absorbed this. Then more quietly, how long were you building as a species? All of this, from the beginning. Vivian walked 3 more steps before she answered. Long enough, she said. She did not say more. Crane did not ask again. Behind them in the council chamber, 42 delegations were in recess, moving in small clusters, speaking in the urgent undertones of people updating their understanding of something that had seemed fixed and was no longer. In 2 days, they would reconvene and formally confirm what the corridor conversations had already decided, that humanity was ready for full membership, because humanity had quietly and without announcement been ready for a long time. The Narath situation resolved faster than Vivian had projected, which she noted in her personal log as a data point for future estimates. The visible presence of 50,000 human ships on a publicly available observation record proved to be a more efficient diplomatic instrument than any statement, resolution, or formal communique the Council had previously produced in its entire history. The Unified Response Force sent a message. It included as a standard attachment the verified contributions figures from all member species. The Narath expansion halted within 48 hours. In the Narath High Command's war chamber, tactical projection systems had run the scenario 10,000 times. Every simulation ended the same way: total fleet annihilation in under 6 hours, 94% casualties, 0 probability of victory. The War Marshal had looked at the numbers for 3 minutes without speaking. Then he had issued the withdrawal order. Voluntary, the official statement said. Their response called the decision voluntary. The Council accepted the language without comment and moved forward. There are moments in diplomacy when accuracy matters less than momentum, and all 42 delegations understood this without being told. Vivian signed the response acknowledgement from her temporary workspace and closed the file. She opened the next item in her queue, the 7th formal treaty consultation request she had received since the inquiry. The Polari had sent theirs first. Within hours of the session ending, the Uvos the following morning, the Orth by end of day. Nathaniel Voss had built a consultation schedule that now ran 4 months forward and was still expanding weekly. He maintained it with the focused patience of a person who had accepted that the map had changed and was committed to being accurate about the new geography. Garrett, at his desk across the office, managed the formal membership documentation backlog. His workspace looked like a filing system that had undergone a significant disagreement with itself. He had not complained about this once, which was Vivian's consistent measure of a good aide. The first private meeting with Shorovac happened 3 days after the inquiry, not the full committee, not a formal proceeding. 2 people, 1 aide each, a small conference room near the Daneki delegation section of the station. They reviewed a shared briefing document together for the first 30 minutes without much conversation. Then Shorovac put the briefing document down. He said without any lead-in, the perseverance. Vivian went completely still. She had not said the name in any session, any brief, any corridor conversation. The Danaki intelligence services were not the kind that announced themselves. You lost 3,000 people, he said. It was not a question. Yes, she said, a logistics error. The resupply ship was given the wrong coordinates. By the time the discrepancy was identified, the timeline had closed. He looked at her steadily. And afterward, she said, we made sure it could not happen to a whole world. A pause. Or a whole species, he said. Yes, the silence that followed was different from all the silences in the council chambers. Those had been political, calculating, full of people working out what information meant for their own positions. This one was the silence of two people from two different species who had both at different points in their histories made the same decision from the same place. The decision that grief of a certain kind does not get set aside or processed into something smaller. It gets built into something large enough that the same event cannot happen again. Then we understand each other, Shorvac said. They signed the preliminary defense framework 4 days later. Shorvac attended the signing in person, which he was not required to do for a document at that level. He signed it, looked at Vivian, nodded once. A single complete Danaki acknowledgement that carried the weight of a much longer statement, and walked out. The Chalari required more time. Their species communicated in ways that demanded patience from every other species around them, and their wariness about the situation ran deep enough that their first 4 formal communications to the human delegation were structured entirely as questions. Vivian answered each one directly and without elaboration. Yes, the fleet exists at the scale you observed. Yes, the figures are accurate. No, the fleet is not oriented toward current council members. No, there is no intention to change that. The 5th communication was different. It came from the Kalari scientific community, not the diplomatic office. They wanted to understand the engineering principles behind operating multiple construction rings at continuous output. The question was academic in framing and entirely sincere in intent. Vivian passed it to the appropriate department on Earth. They sent back a 43-page technical overview. Not the full documentation, but enough to be useful. The 6th Kalari communication was a meeting request. Progress takes the shape it takes. You work with what you are given. Admiral Crane stopped by her office on a Wednesday afternoon carrying 2 cups of coffee from the portable machine which the Council Station's catering division had officially licensed to the human delegation after the Vayoth Administrative Office submitted a formal inquiry about broader availability. Vivian had privately considered this the most concrete measure of humanity's new standing at the Council. Not the voting seat, not the treaty roster. The coffee. Crane set a cup in front of her and sat across the desk. The Sarandai want an answer on the joint patrol proposal. Yes, with the 2 modifications Garrett flagged. He has the file. The Polari ambassador wants a meeting next week, Tuesday afternoon. Fine. The Narath border monitoring resolution needs a human vote before Friday. I have it. Crane wrapped both hands around his cup. He looked at her with the expression he used when he had been holding a question for a while and had decided it was time. Can I ask you something personal? Probably not, she said, but you will anyway. He did anyway. Were you ever worried that it would go the wrong direction, that the council would respond to finding out about the fleet not with recalculation toward partnership, but with the other kind, the kind that ends badly? Vivian looked at her coffee. Yes. But you submitted the form anyway. They asked for our military assets. We provided our military assets. She set her cup down. The alternative was providing false information on an official council document, and that was not something I was willing to do. But if it had gone wrong, she was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the council station's orbital array turned in its slow, reliable way. The same motion it had been making for decades. Unconcerned with the conversations happening inside it. Then it would have been wrong, honestly, she said. We were not going to misrepresent ourselves in order to be accepted. We built what we built. We are what we are. If the council could not work with the reality of that, it would better to know clearly and deal with it directly than to manage a misunderstanding for the next 50 years. Crane looked at his cup. He was quiet for a moment. 3 delegations sent you personal notes after the inquiry. I saw them in the communications log. They were personal. The notes said what people say when they discover they have not been alone in something they all thought they were alone in, she said. It was kind of them to write. I appreciated the thought. She did not say more than that. She did not explain what it is like to have spent 11 years being the smallest representative in a very large room, speaking for a species that had built something enormous and kept it unremarked. Not from strategy, not from calculation, but from the simple understanding that the galaxy was not yet ready to know, and that when the galaxy finally learned what mattered was not the reaction in the first hour, but what was built in the months that followed. Crane nodded slowly. He finished his coffee. He left. 2 weeks later, he was back, this time without coffee and with a printout in his hand. He set it on her desk. The quarterly fleet count, he said. Yes. It is higher than last quarter. Yes. The construction rings. 2 hit milestone output ahead of schedule, Vivian said. A third is being expanded to handle support vessel production under the new bilateral framework commitments. The frameworks require capacity. We build to what we need. Crane looked at the printout for a moment. He opened his mouth, closed it. Some questions he had learned did not need to be asked because the answer was already visible in the quarterly reports that kept climbing. He picked up the printout and walked out without another word. On Vivian's desk in a simple frame that Garrett had placed there. The week they moved into the new office, calling it a historical artifact which was accurate, was a printout of the original contribution form confirmation receipt. 1 page, header information, submission timestamp, a row of field entries, each one confirming a successfully accepted value. Section 7C, military assets. In the valued output field where the council's intake system had attempted to render the figure she submitted and found it could not, there was a row of question marks. She looked at it sometimes, not with pride and not with the particular brightness of someone who has won something. She looked at it the way you look at a photograph of a place that no longer exists in the form you knew it, with something complicated and specific that does not reduce to a single word. She thought about the word approximate in the original form language, as if any figure she submitted would be an estimate, a rounding, a number to be refined later by someone who understood numbers better. She thought about 3,000 names on a memorial database that most people accessed once, if at all. She thought about the way grief moves through a species, how it does not stay in the people who knew the people who were lost. It spreads outward. It moves through policy decisions and allocation priorities and late-night debates about force structure, and slowly over years becomes something else entirely. It becomes preparation. It becomes the thing you build so that when the coordinates go wrong again, when the clerical error happens again, when someone makes a decision at a desk in a building that costs people on the other end of the distance, there is enough of everything else to compensate. You build ahead of it. You keep building. You build until the number is too large for the form's field to hold. Then you build some more. Because enough is a number that only the dead can calculate. And the living owe them more than that. Part 3, the new galaxy. 6 weeks after the full council inquiry, the vote came. Nearly 3 months had passed since 51,000 human ships appeared on the observation feeds and recalibrated the galaxy's understanding of power. Vivian had expected it would take longer. The procedural machinery of the Galactic Council was built for deliberation, not speed. Committees needed to convene. Subcommittees needed to report. Language needed to be drafted, reviewed, amended, and redrafted. The council moved like a glacier, slowly, inevitably, reshaping everything in its path. But the perseverance had changed the timeline, not the ship itself. The story of it. 3,000 people, one wrong number. A species that decided never again meant never again. The vote was scheduled for a Tuesday, the same day of the week the inquiry had opened. Vivian appreciated the symmetry even if no one had planned it that way. The chamber was full, all 42 delegations present. The observer gallery packed with staff and analysts and beings whose job it was to witness history and write it down accurately for people who would read about it later and wonder what it had felt like to be in the room. The High Arbiter read the resolution language. Standard format. Proposal to elevate the human delegation from observer status to full member status with all attendant rights, responsibilities, and voting privileges. The language took 4 minutes to read. The vote took 30 seconds. 31 in favor, 6 abstentions, 5 opposed. For a moment, no one moved. The numbers had been expected. The delegations had counted votes in quarter conversations for days. But seeing them displayed made it real. Humanity was no longer waiting in the gallery. They were at the table, with 500,000 ships standing behind their chair. The 5 opposed were all species with territorial interests adjacent to human-aligned space. Their opposition was noted in the record, carefully processed and completely irrelevant to the outcome. The High Arbiter struck the ceremonial chime once. The resolution is adopted. Humanity is recognized as a full member of the Galactic Council effective immediately. There was no applause. The council did not applaud. But there was a sound, a collective exhalation, the room releasing tension it had been holding since the moment 51,000 ships appeared on the observation feed and recalibrated what the word fleet meant. Vivian stood. She placed her hand over her heart, the human gesture for formal acknowledgement. She held it for 3 seconds. Then she sat back down. In the third seat left of the High Arbiter, the seat had been empty for the entire vote, waiting. Now it had a nameplate, Vivian Ashford, Human Delegation, and a dedicated terminal, and a voting panel, and the legal standing to propose agenda items, contest proceedings, and speak with the full weight of a member species behind every word. She had moved from the waiting room to the main table. It had taken 11 years. The view from the third seat left of the High Arbiter was less interesting than the view from the upper observer gallery. The angle was wrong, the ceiling pressed down instead of opening up. But the chair had something the gallery seat never had. Power. Not the kind you perform, the kind you use. Ishaya. Garrett appeared at her side in the corridor after the session. He did not say anything. He did not need to. He had been with her for 2 years and 7 weeks. He had watched her fill out forms while ambassadors gave speeches. He had carried 2 kilograms of documentation to a security committee that thought it was conducting a routine verification. He had seen the Polari nectarine a color xenobiologist would spend the next decade trying to classify. He handed her a tablet with the updated schedule. 17 treaty consultations, 43 bilateral framework discussions, 6 joint committee appointments, 2 defense coordination working groups. The galaxy was reorganizing itself around a new center of gravity, and the center was holding very still, drinking coffee and updating spreadsheets. Nathaniel wants to know if you need him to prioritize the UVOS trade framework or the Sarandai cultural exchange. UVOS first, Vivian said. The Sarandai are being thorough because they want to be certain. The UVOs are being thorough because they are afraid we will say no. Different motivations require different sequencing. Garrett made a note. Admiral Crane asked if you have time this afternoon. Tell him 15 minutes at 400 hours. I have a thing at 4:30. The thing is the Chilari technical delegation. They sent an updated question list, 47 items. I saw it, they are good questions. She kept walking. Garrett kept pace. The ORTH delegation sent a formal request for an in-person meeting. They specified it should be at your earliest convenience, but are willing to wait as long as necessary. They also noted they would be bringing a physical object that requires careful handling. Vivian stopped. When did the request come in? This morning, logged at 0600. Schedule them for Thursday afternoon and make sure the meeting room can accommodate a large object. The ORTH do not make small things when they decide something is worth making. Saya. The ORTH arrived on Thursday with 7 delegation members and a crate. The crate was 2 meters long, 1 meter wide, and half a meter deep. It was made of something that looked like wood, but was not. The grain was too perfect, the weight distribution too precise. ORTH craftsmanship did not approximate natural materials. It improved on them. They set the crate on the table in the center of the meeting room with the careful attention of people handling something that had taken a long time to make and mattered more than the sum of its parts. The lead artisan was named Korath. His skin had the deep gray-blue color that indicated advanced age in his species, and his hands moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had spent decades learning exactly how much pressure every material required and never forgot. He opened the crate. Inside was a model, a scale model of a human Class 4 Dreadnought, built entirely by hand. 4 months of work, according to the documentation Garrett had pulled. Every detail accurate to within 0.03% of the actual vessel dimensions. The hull plating was individual pieces of fitted composite. The engine array was articulated. The sensor grid was etched at microscopic scale. It was not a toy, it was an argument made in physical form. Korath lifted it from the crate and placed it on the table. The model was nearly 1.5 meters long. It caught the light from the room's overhead panels and held it the way the real ships held starlight. Present, patient, built to last. Ambassador Ashford, Korath said. His voice had the texture of someone who did not speak often, but chose words carefully when he did. My people have a tradition. When we encounter something we do not understand, we build a representation of it. The process of building forces us to see the thing clearly, to understand its structure, its purpose, the intention behind its design. He gestured to the model. 3 months ago, we saw your fleet, 51,000 vessels. We did not understand what we were seeing, so we decided to build. He paused. This is one ship. It took 4 months, 17 artisans working in rotation. We learned things building it that we could not have learned any other way. How the hull sections distribute stress, how the engine configuration balances thrust and heat dissipation, how every element serves a purpose and no element is wasted. He looked at Vivian. We understand now what you built, and we understand why you built it. Vivian stood. She walked to the table. She looked at the model for a long moment. She reached out and touched the hull plating with one finger. The surface was cool, smooth. The seams between plates were invisible unless you knew where to look. This is extraordinary work, she said. It is accurate work, Koreth said. Accuracy is what the subject required. She looked at Team. You built this to understand us. We built this to respect what you survived, he said. Loss of that magnitude leaves marks. On people, on species, on the things they build afterward. We see the marks. We understand them. The room held the silence. Then Koreth reached into his jacket and removed a small data chip. This contains the complete technical documentation of our build process. We are sharing it with your Naval Engineering Division. Not because we think you need it, but because the sharing of knowledge is how civilizations that respect each other move forward. He placed the chip on the table beside the model. The model is a gift for your office, so you remember that the galaxy sees what you built, and some of us understand why. Vivian picked up the chip. She held it for a moment. Then she looked at Koreth and the 6 artisans standing behind him. Thank you, she said. This will be displayed where it can be seen, and the documentation will be shared with the people who build the real ones. Koreth nodded, the Orth gesture for acknowledgement, a slow tilt of the head that carried weight. They left the model on the table. That evening, Vivian sat in her office with the model on the shelf behind her desk. The light from the station's exterior windows caught it at an angle, and for a moment it looked like it was moving, sliding through space the way the real ships did. Silent, patient, waiting for orders that might never come but would be followed immediately if they did. She turned back to her terminal. The quarterly fleet report had updated an hour ago. Current active inventory 537,891 Class 4 and above vessels. The variance was larger this cycle. Construction Ring 7 had come online ahead of schedule. Ring 3 had exceeded output projections by 18%. The number kept growing. She opened the file and read through the details. Maintenance rotations, resource allocation, crew training pipeline status. The endless logistics of maintaining something too large for most administrative systems to render properly. There was a knock at the door. Come in. Admiral Crane entered. He had a folder under his arm and the expression of someone who had been thinking about something for a while and had decided to say it out loud. The Danaki sent the final language for the joint training exercise, he said. Shorovac signed it personally. Good. Crane set the folder on her desk. He did not leave. They want to do a live fire demonstration, full fleet integration. Their capital ships working in formation with ours. They are calling it Operation Shared Resolve. When 6 months, they want time to prepare their crews for operating at scale. Vivian nodded. Crane sat down in the chair across from her desk. He looked at the model on the shelf. The Orth brought that today. Yes. 4 months of work. 4 months to build one ship. We have 537,000. Crane was quiet for a moment. Do you ever think about what happens if the building stops? Vivian looked at him. The building does not stop, she said. The building is what we do now. It is what we became after the Perseverance. A species that builds until the number is too large for the galaxy's systems to count, and then builds more. But at some point, she said, the galaxy will be a place where no one has to build like this because no one has to be afraid of losing 3,000 people to a clerical error. When that day comes, we will reassess. She looked back at her terminal. Until then, the rings keep running. Crane stood. He picked up the folder. He looked at the model one more time. The Orth saw what we built, he said quietly, and they decided to understand it instead of fear it. Yes, that is not a small thing. No, Vivian said. It is not. He left. Late that night, when the station had cycled into its rest period, and the corridors were empty except for the automated cleaning systems and the occasional late-shift analyst moving between departments, Vivian stood at the window of her office and looked out at the dark. 2 light towers away, the fleet was still there. Not the demonstration deployment. That had returned to operational positions weeks ago. But the galaxy's long-range observation arrays were good enough that you could track fleet movements across multiple sectors if you knew where to look and had the clearance to access the feeds. She pulled up the tactical display on her terminal. 537,000 ships, distributed across 17 sectors, holding patrol routes, conducting training exercises, rotating through maintenance cycles, operating with the quiet, methodical efficiency of a force that had been built for a purpose and took that purpose seriously. No one was attacking them. No one was threatening them. They were simply there, present, ready, the way a wall stands when a wall is what you need. She thought about the perseverance. 3,000 names, 3,000 people who had families and friends and plans for what they would do when the logistics run was finished and they rotated back to Earth for leave. 3,000 people who died because someone typed a 7 instead of a 9. She thought about the memorial database, how it was designed to be accessed once, to allow people to find a name, read a short biography, see a photograph, and then close the file and move forward with their lives. But some people did not close the file. Some people kept it open. Some people took the grief and the rage and the helpless, horrible understanding that it should not have happened and could have been prevented and built something with it. They built until the galaxy's administrative systems could not render the number. They built until observation arrays had to recalibrate their scale indicators. They built until the word fleet meant something different than it had meant before. And then they kept building. Because enough was not a number you reached. It was a direction you moved in. Forever. Until there was nothing left in the universe that required you to be ready, and even then you stayed ready anyway because the cost of being wrong once was 3,000 names on a database that most people only looked at once. She closed the tactical display. She looked at the model on the shelf. 1 ship, 4 months of work, 17 artisans, built to understand what humanity had become. She thought about Koreth's words. Loss of that magnitude leaves marks. Yes, it leaves marks. It leaves 537,000 marks, each one 4 kilometers long, and armed for sustained planetary siege operations, and crewed by people who understand exactly what they are protecting and why. It leaves a galaxy that looks at humanity differently now. Not with pity, not with condescension, not with the patient, slightly patronizing tolerance that observers receive from members. With calculation, with respect, with the specific, careful attention that species pay to other species they have decided are worth understanding. She turned off the desk lamp. She walked to the door. She looked back once at the model silhouetted against the window, backlit by the station's exterior lights. 1 ship, built by hand, built to see clearly, built to understand. She turned off the office lights and closed the door behind her. Outside, 2 light towers away, the fleet held position. 537,891 vessels in perfect formation, distributed across operational sectors, holding patrol routes, conducting training rotations, maintaining the careful, disciplined readiness of a force that had been built from grief and rage and the absolute unshakable conviction that never again meant never again. They were not threatening anyone. They were not performing for anyone. They were not proving anything to anyone. They were simply there. The way a foundation holds when the structure above it needs holding. The way a wall stands when the people behind it need standing. The way a species holds when it has learned at great cost and from a young age exactly what it means to build ahead of everything it is afraid of. The ships did not move unless ordered. They did not speak unless spoken to. They did not fire unless fired upon. But they were there, patient, present, waiting, not with eagerness, not with anticipation, not with the hunger of a weapon waiting to be used, with the calm, settled certainty of a promise being kept. We will never be caught without enough again. We will never lose 3,000 people because someone made one mistake with one number. We will never stand helpless while a rescue timeline closes and people we could have saved die in the dark. Never again. The word never is not a wish. It is not a hope. It is not a prayer offered up to a universe that does not care about prayers. It is a commitment, made in steel and composite in reactor cores that burn at temperatures that would vaporize stars. Made in the hands of crews who train until firing solutions become reflex. Made in construction rings that operate on independent scheduling and produce 2,400 new vessels every 90 days. Made in the quiet, deliberate work of a species that looked at its grief and decided grief alone was not enough. You had to build something with it, something larger than the loss, something strong enough that the loss could never happen again. So they built, and they kept building, and they would keep building for as long as anything in the galaxy gave them reason to, which they understood would be a very long time. The ships held position, silent, patient, ready. The way a species holds when it has decided that the living owe the dead more than memory. They owe them tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day that follows. For as long as the stars burn and the universe remembers that 3,000 people once died because someone typed the wrong number. And humanity said never again, and meant it. But, and